Okay, so we have documentation, and we've had a documentation project since Helium. In Hydrogen, the documentation we produced was literally wiki pages, which, there we go, and now everything is doing the right thing. All right. So if you, and so I've been involved in this one way or another, and of course it's gonna just keep not, why isn't terminal coming up?
You have your power pack?
What?
You have your power pack? Because I think your battery's getting low.
70%.
Okay. What's the red thing?
What's the red thing? Oh, that's CPU.
Sorry.
It's all good. Terminal, there we go. That's what I need. All right. And if I go over here, will it appear on the screen? No. Okay, so let me grab a terminal, drag it over, and I'll show some things in a second. Where am I with my cursor? There we go. Is it over here? There we go. All right. So in Helium, and I'll just bring this up because it's easy. In Hydrogen, I think we had sorts of, didn't we have hydrogen? So if you go to the wiki and you go search for, let's do like, hydrogen user guide. Yeah, here we go. So like in hydrogen, like this is what we did. And this is sort of, I could imagine something that was worse than this, but it would be hard. So we, and so we had and this is the developer guide, and sort of it was all technical content. It was basically just admitting the fact that, honestly what it was is it was admitting the fact that the only documentation that we were going to be able to produce in Hydrogen was documentation that we had produced for the wiki for people that were shipping hydrogen. And so as a consequence, you might as well keep it all in the wiki and just point to it. And that was kind of a disaster. And then so for Helium, essentially Matthew, let me, there we go, that'll work. Can people see that okay? For Helium, and I'm on stable Helium, so this is what the documentation was. Matthew set up a basically, let's try this. Doesn't tree?
I did nothing.
Brew, install tree maybe? Will that help? It doesn't matter. Tree just lets you show the directory structure easily. So if there's manuals what you need to look at. So there's a bunch of different manuals that got created. I'm just going to show one of them, which is the install guide. And so basically, if you look here and, tree, how do you do depth in tree? Does anybody know? So basically, if you look at this, there's like a source main ASCII doc, tree-L, capital L. Okay, so like.
In fact, one little thing is we actually started with docbook XML.
Yeah.
And then we wanted to do it ourselves, and so we kind of moved.
So basically, we did what you, if you're programmers, you're going to do when you make documentation, which is that we found a thing that takes source code, compiles it into a reasonable output, and we started working on that. And what we really did is we stole the OpenStack documentation chain. Matthew did the hard work of making it actually work, and so you ended up with something like this. So I'm in the install guide. I can do maven clean install, and it's going to go off for a second, and I think this is going to take 30 seconds at the moment. And it builds the documentation, and it turns it into a PDF, which and some HTML. And this will come up in a second.
Basically, we took the style sheets from OpenStack that does the XSL. So if there's is there an XML style sheet expert in the?
So anyway, so there's a whole lot of simplification. So this goes off, it runs for a while, and then it turns out it doesn't actually produce. I have no idea where it actually stores the PDFs. I've never learned. I just do that. Why?
Target.
Why didn't find dot startup PDF work?
Web help.
Oh, find dot dash name. I'm too tired. Okay, and so that then produces something that looks kind of like, if I can remember which direction things go, like this, which is the documentation you see, and if you've seen before, and actually if you go to here, the software downloads page, and I'll make this much bigger. This is sort of what gets stored in like the installation guide. So like if I go click here, that is, oh, that's good. Where's Phil? That's Phil's fault. So you end up with something like this. No, so actually, this is actually one of the other problems. That is good to know. Could somebody send Phil an email saying the install guide for SR3 is broken? I'm serious. And actually, I'm going to ask him to post SR4 anyway soon. So anyway, so this generates PDF documentation. So that's sort of the current, and that's pretty much what we've been using since then. And if you're interested in sort of how this gets done, so like here is the install guide, and this is the user guide now. But here's the installation guide in a PDF. And like if you look, there's a whole bunch of release notes for Helium SR4. And this says the following projects have no changes. And basically, the way you see that is I should probably move my mic. Oh, I see it's just fallen all the way down. I'll just clip it on. Apparently, don't wear a t-shirt if you're talking at a conference. That's what I've learned. All right. And so if you look at actually what's being produced here, you can do, let me get into here, mate. And I'm just text mate is just going to open that, and I'm going to do source main ASCII doc core release notes.adoc. And if you actually, and that's over here, and I can't remember which direction my screens go, but that's okay. And so that ends up looking something like this, which I wonder if I can make it bigger. Let me just less it. That'll be easier. So basically, the format is ASCII doc. ASCII doc looks a lot like the wiki for most things, which is kind of nice. And it says the release notes are at the top, the key features are here, and weirdly, this whole next part is commented out because that's what the giant 4 slashes mean. That's a comment block. And then it says the target environment is this for execution, for development. Here are the Helium SR4 release notes, the following things. So this is sort of what the docs currently look like, which is that, and that's a list, and links are formatted in a certain way, but the syntax is pretty easy to follow. And so this then gets compiled through our Maven toolchain, and if you've done everything right, it doesn't blow up on you. If you've done things wrong, it blows up on you in nasty, nasty ways that make no sense, and that results in Colin writing pages that look like this, which are common errors and what they look like and how they break. So it's like you can't have a broken image. You can't have a bare image. So this is broken, but this is fine. The build error looks like file colon da da da. So this is a page I wrote, which is basically how ASCII Doctor is going to blow up on you and what the error message is going to look like for everything that I've experienced. And this has been successful in basically getting people to be able to produce docs that usually build. I'm not saying that it's fantastic, but it gets you there. And then the other part is, in theory, there's an HTML. And if you open target, and then, is it web help? I think it is. This is, and so this is what happens when you get HTML out of it, which I think is one of the things that we're going to talk about here, which is that the HTML is unusable. Because like, essentially every individual thing is its own page that you can't, like, there's no way to get any substantial amount of documentation on any given page, right? Like, that is not a useful HTML format of documentation. That's basically, and so that's one of the reasons why HTML came up. And so for what it's worth, there is also, and I'm just trying to do a grand tour of how docs currently work without trying to say that it's good or bad, just to understand what we have. If you go to GitHub, I can't actually read anything that I'm typing. I should really mirror my screen. GitHub, OpenDaylight, docs. I'm going to go switch my branch to stable Helium, manuals, install guide is one of these things. And there's also XML because we fixed that. And I go to source main ASCII doc. If I go to like the core release notes, like this is actually rendered nicely and it's actually it's kind of interesting that essentially you can, a bunch of our documentation, you can browse directly from the source on GitHub, and it actually looks pretty decent. There's a couple of caveats, which is that because of the way images are imported in ASCII doc, that the directory to go look at in images is actually just find in the POM file, which means that because this is not parsing the POM file, it won't load images correctly. Also, it doesn't include files well, so like that's, so what you'd really like to do is be able to go to the book install guide, which is the core thing. But instead of getting the install guide all as one page, you get just links to the individually included things. And so there's so this is sort of, I'm trying to think if there's anything else I should show, but that's sort of the current state of documentation. There's a whole other question about generating good content, which I'm going to make orthogonal to this. But if people want to talk to about it, we can. But sort of from the point of view of how do we take, assuming that we have English content in sort of sections that users want to read, how do we get it into their hands? This is currently what we do. And basically what we do is that we have ASCII doc, we compile it, it produces HTML and PDFs. The HTML documents are essentially unusable because of the way that they're formatted, and so we put the PDFs on the website, people can download the PDFs. We've had a huge number of complaints from users that they would much rather have searchable HTML than PDFs, which I agree. And we've also had, and in addition to that, we have yeah, that's basically, I mean, that's sort of where we are. In addition to that, we've had complaints that people can't even find the PDFs, which is, I say we have documentation, everybody ends up on the wiki. Nobody actually goes and finds these PDFs. And the PDFs are mixed quality once you get there. Right? That's sort of like I guess it's been about 10, 15 minutes. So the 10 or 15 minute introductory docs, what we have, how it's built, and what it turns into. And Art, you look like you've had things you wanted to say. And there's a mic on the table if you wanted to use it. That'll actually get recorded.
Thank you. Yeah, I just had a question about the markup. I've noticed as I've gone through the HTML documentation, some look like this, where it has just the file name, which isn't particularly helpful. A lot are worse, where it shows the entire, you see that list just like that, but it shows the entire tree, and and you see pom.xml, and a lot of things that if you click on, it's not going to take you to what you actually want. Now, are those things with the existing markup, like those right there? Could I have a title there
That's a good question.
as a hyperlink using the existing markup?
Well, so I think that there is, let me check something really quickly. So let me do less source main ASCII doc.
And just the reason why I'm asking is because it seems to me like one little thing that someone who's not an expert could do is come in and clean up the markup to make it more browsable.
So the answer is that's not. So the answer is includes are rendered in. Okay. So ASCII doc is designed to be actually compiled, to some target format. When you view it on GitHub, it can't. It can't really compile it. So what it's doing is rendering a partial compilation of that file. And the thing which you can't do when you just view it on GitHub is do an include properly. And so instead of doing the include properly, it expresses a hyperlink to that file. And so the hyperlinks that work correctly are not includes, they are actually links in ASCII doc, which point to another location. And I don't know if those actually work. I would be surprised if maybe they do. That would be really complicated to make them work. I mean, one of the things is hyperlinks between ASCII doc files actually are not resolvable unless you've compiled the whole thing because you have to be in the scope of the document that's produced. And so this is not here to show you that, I think this is the future, is to view it on GitHub. It's just to show you that it is possible, although it's a reasonable idea on the face of it. It turns out there's some complications. It's in order to show that, hey, this is also using ASCII Doctor, which is the same core engine that's compiling ASCII doc for us. So we should be able to configure ASCII Doctor to do the right thing. And in fact, you can download ASCII Doctor, and it's just a command you run at the command line, like GCC, and it takes in an ASCII doc file, and it just does the right thing. And instead, we're using sort of this weird thing that goes all the way from, we got from OpenStack, that goes from ASCII doc to docbook to HTML and PDF. And so anyway, this is, there's a couple of things. One of them is that we would like to be able to I think there's configuration for ASCII Doctor. well, okay, there's a bunch of things. First of all, the way this actually compiles is that it goes out and it downloads a custom Maven plugin, which Matthew wrote, which is based on top of the ASCII Doctor compiler that OpenStack uses. And we could probably pull all of that out and just write a Maven plugin on top of ASCII Doctor. And in fact, there's just a Maven ASCII Doctor plugin, which I think we could use by verbatim.
There's more to it than that. It's not about the plugin, it's about the style sheets and the macros. There's a shitload of macros, that exist and that we don't use properly in the ASCII doc that helps you generate the HTML properly. The reason why
So-
our HTML is not properly generated is because we don't use the right macros that don't get translated into the right output that don't actually end up being
Okay, so because we're actually recording this, I'll just translate what Matthew said to something. But what Matthew said was basically it's not that simple. That basically a lot of what you're getting out of the plugin is not just the Maven ASCII Doctor plugin, but is actually a deeper set of issues where there's macros and things like that defined, which in theory should help you produce better HTML, and then we're not using them correctly, which is entirely possible. And you had a question in the back, and you can pass the mic. I mean, it's just easy.
Has there been any discussion or consideration given to maybe using something like Atlassian's Confluence, the open source version? Because I guess it works really well for Honors, and I mean, it's kind of gives a single source of documentation and truth, and it's easy to navigate, search, and I think that's one of the big wins that Honors has over OpenDaylight. I mean, it can be used in conjunction with the wiki, but I mean, it can also be used in place of.
So there's a really broad discussion going on, of which Casey is sort of in the center of the room, has been talking about. And I can give you my personal take on this, which is that we sort of have four kinds of documentation, or fair documentation. We have four kinds of users. The first kind of user is somebody that is either non-technical or glancingly technical. They're like a VP of a Fortune 500 company, and they want to know what OpenDaylight is about and why they should care, and should they send engineers to the OpenDaylight Summit. For those people, my assertion is that they should be going to opendaylight.org, and the Linux Foundation is responsible for that content.
Yeah,
The second, so anyway, the last three are the people that are interesting. We have network operators, or administrators, users, like these are end users. Then we have developers that are external to OpenDaylight. That is, like people that are going to use OpenDaylight to build something, but they're not interested in building code in OpenDaylight. The last thing is we have what I call contributors, which are developers inside OpenDaylight. And I think that you're going to want to develop drastically different content for each of those different pieces. And right now, sort of what we do for that is one is OpenDaylight.org and the Linux Foundation responsible for that. Two should be the user guide and the installation guide, which we ought to figure out a way to publish them well. If Confluence is a way to publish them well, great. I don't really care. I just want to get them out there. There's a question about sort of whether that should be integrated with the stuff we develop for developers, where right now we use the developer guide for external developers and the wiki for sort of contributors and internal developers. And I think, in my mind, the concern which I have is just the wiki is such a disaster.
Yeah.
And fixing it actually will hurt its utility for other purposes, which is like the wiki right now, and here's my personal take, and I think there are people that disagree with me, so I'll just say this out there. There are two goals, and they're sort of diametrically opposed. One of them is to get developers to write anything at all down, no matter what, no matter how crappy it is, no matter how harebrained it is, just write something down so that way it doesn't get lost forever. And that's sort of what the wiki is currently, which is like it's a scratch pad for developers' imaginations.
Okay.
And the second thing is how do we develop curated, user-focused documentation, which is up to date. We try and make sure that it's not about 2 versions ago, et cetera. And my worry is that if you use the same tool to do both without a real clear delineation of when you cross from A to B, that you're going to hurt both use cases, which is that either you're going to end up inhibiting collection of information from developers quickly, which does matter. Like there is this lowering the bar to be able to get something written down somewhere, or you're going to end up making it so that way users end up getting inundated with crappy content. And I think that I'm open to any solution which meets those needs. So I know Casey has talked about trying to get a KMS, something like Confluence or something, or some other knowledge management system to be able to produce curated content for end users. But you're on exactly the right path. I'm just sort of trying to lay out where we are and maybe how that, I don't know how that entirely helps, but my gut reaction is we want to have different systems. I could be wrong.
Yeah, I mean, for developers, I would say, write good Java doc, comments and stuff like that. Generate Java doc from that because it's just in code, explaining
Yeah,
the API for each method and attribute and whatever. And then to understand conceptually, like, there's on the wiki several explanations of MD-SAL.
Yes.
And one of them is called, model model-driven, whatever it is, model-driven abstraction layer, and one of them is model-driven adaptation layer.
No, no, and so just to be clear, when I say when sort of where developers write stuff down, it's not just JavaDoc. I mean, it's like things like, I've written a whole bunch of code, and there's JavaDoc which explains some of it, but there is the glue that tells another developer, hey, here are the steps that there is sort of developer-to-developer internal, writing non-code things down for which we use the wiki. And there's a lot of that stuff that gets generated, which is absolutely critical to the functioning of the project. Case in point, we wrote this huge, long thing about how to move to Carafe, which no user should ever look at. Right? And really probably no external developer should ever look at. But it's hugely useful to have a place to go stick that. And so as long as we have a way to warn users, like, look, you're looking at really raw content, don't use this unless there's no other place to go look for it. I think we would do us well to steer people away from the wiki unless you're
maybe
really...
that's the medium that, the wiki is perfect medium for that. And then maybe, Confluence for kind of being a single source of truth for, conceptual.
And that's so there's the second anyway. There's a couple other details. I mean, so I was to write down the list of sort of requirements. I think I did this at some point, tried to. But one of them is we want to produce reasonable HTML documentation. 2, we need a way to curate that documentation. And sort of 3, we need a way to version it. We'd like to be able to version it. Would you like to be able to have a Helium version of the documentation that lives alongside a Lithium version of the documentation, both of which can evolve forward? And that's where sort of wikis tend to fail. But truth of the matter is that's less important right now than just getting good content up there. And so I would be willing to give that up if it was a way to get better content. Dave, you were going to say something, and there's mics running all around. So.
Oh, I was going to say something.
Oh, in case.
So I'll bring it to you.
No,
but
Casey,
I
go
did
ahead.
have a quick comment that I wanted to make, though, is that if we do decide to have a delineation between the documentation that we have for users and the wiki, yes, we definitely would need somebody to curate that content. Where are we going to find somebody to curate that content? Because right now, it's already not happening. We don't have funding to necessarily
that's not
hire
true.
somebody to do that. How is this going to get done?
So this
And
came.
maintained.
I mean, so this is the question. But Dave, you were going to say something, so I'll let you talk first because I don't have any answers to that.
I was going to say that I think it's okay having users going to the wiki. I think the wiki is a great place to low barrier to entry, draft, and improve on docs. And I agree with you that when you've got something that's a guide or something that you expect to live for a longer time or be more useful or be version specific, so this is appropriate for Lithium but not Beryllium, for example, then you want to go to version control. And the thing I like about using the wiki to draft docs is that, as you mentioned, ASCII doc is not that far away from MediaWiki. And, we've already taken content from MediaWiki and ASCII docized it. ASCII doc's not a word, so ASCII docized is also,
Not a
okay.
word. It's no worse than you started.
So I actually think it's more than fine to use the wiki for active, engaged user documentation. The thing about ASCII doc and version control is you see a drop-off, very steep drop-off in drive-by edits, in kind of quick drafts, right? The kind of the quick and dirty. I had a thing that I wanted to do and I did it. Here's how. That can be iterated on and improved, and you don't get that if it's Git version control.
And I'm actually curious if we can actually. I mean, like.
Honestly, you could create a tool that
Yeah.
pushes it down.
You could create a tool that pushes it down.
I mean that's actually that's just something which I thought about, which is, but I mean I'm not married to Git. I don't think there and the ASCII doc stuff. It happens to be. I I mean, largely the reason we did this because that's what I inherited, and I wanted to produce something as opposed to nothing. And I think we could use, so there's two questions here, and I think both of them are pretty much what Casey brought up. Which is one of them is that if we're going to change the tooling, we need to find somebody to help develop the new tooling, or we need to find a better tool. And the second thing is like, and this is a broader question, which is who's going to actually do the curating? And I think we genuinely need at least one full-time person who their top of stack activity is documentation for OpenDaylight, which is say that if there's an ask for OpenDaylight documentation, that is the top of their priority list, and we don't have anybody for whom that is the case anywhere in any organization right now.
So you said it earlier, though. I mean, we just need good docs, right? The tools are not necessarily the problem. I will say that using the wiki for everything is a bad idea, and you mentioned API docs, and we've got REST APIs and Java APIs their documentation is a 300K file, a wiki page, right?
Well, I mean, and we do have actually, we're moving.
That's wrong. That's bad. We shouldn't do that.
And we're moving in better directions, which is like I think Ton. Where did Ton go? Okay, so maybe. So Ton and Andy run our infrastructure, and one of the things that we've been doing is we're moving to building all of our code using Jenkins Job Builder, and as part of doing that, we've started to also sort of homogenize what our build files look like. And so, for instance, everybody is now generating JavaDoc. And so modifying things so that way correctly, which is modifying things that we produced, daily one gargantuan JavaDoc site, which has a JavaDoc for all of OpenDaylight, would be something that's entirely within the realm of reason right now. And also generating it so that way the docs get published and actually automatically stored somewhere is something that's entirely within reason. But this is these are all, if people are interested in helping out, I sort of have some ideas about how you would go and get this, and I'm sure Ton has other ideas. But we need people to do that work. We need people to help actually curate content, and we need people to sort of sit down and try and help do pilots. I mean, like if we want to use Confluence, do you want to help sit down? We have a Jira account. We have a test. You could show, hey, here's how we would do it on Confluence. I mean, that's really what's missing right now is just boots on the ground playing around with these ideas and trying to make them real. And one of the things I've noticed about OpenDaylight is, at least in my experience, the thing that stops progress is not people not wanting to do things. It's people not giving good enough instructions on how everybody else can follow. That if you have a good idea and you document it well and explain to other people how to go do it, that we've gone through those hoops. And that's, case in point, we did manage to get everybody into Carafe, that pretty much worked. We've gotten everybody into Jenkins Job Builder, that pretty much worked. And it was by building tools and giving good instructions. And if we build tools and give good instructions about how to move to any other documentation platform, people will follow you as long as the output is good. But there's actual work involved, and the reason why we haven't made progress is basically because I haven't had time to do work. And so this is really a plea of, I understand exactly where we are and why it sucks, and how we get out of it is something which I haven't had time to spend enough time to do. And this is sort of a plea. Anybody who's out there that wants to help try and get our documentation pipeline to work in the right way and has ideas, please come and help.
So I just had a quick comment that David said, that he thought that our tools were probably fine and that we just needed to refine our processes and stuff like that. But right. Well, yeah. But changing the tools is also going to provide us with, in some sense, better documentation. And by better documentation, I mean like what I'm specifically thinking of is like dynamic containerized information. We can't do that currently within our wiki, or we can kind of do it on OpenDaylight.org. But if I want to put like project information or a code snippet or something like that somewhere on one of the wiki pages, and then reference that somewhere else in the wiki, you have to basically copy and paste it or retype that.
That's not true. There's all sorts of, you can very easily pull in a section of a MediaWiki page to another MediaWiki page, and I do it all the time. It's just a matter of understanding the tooling.
Well, what I'm saying is you can pull it in there, but as far as I understand, or at least right now, if I go edit one of them, it doesn't go edit, automatically update, it does.
You can, and in fact, the Beryllium release plan has a really good example of this, where we actually, the documentation requirements and the integration requirements are actually subsets of separate pages sucked directly in. So you can do that, it's just a matter of understanding your tooling. It's not always the prettiest thing in the world, but there are MediaWiki plugins that absolutely let you reference named subparts of another page, and not just reference, I mean pull them in the exact content. There's a little bit of caching issues where it is that like, it takes a day for everything to sort itself out unless you do a null edit, and a null edit is the stupidest concept that anybody's ever come up to update a cache invalidation, but it does work. I think that it's understanding requirements, which are the ability to suck in documentation from other places, is useful. So I mean, like that would be, and also I think the other huge one that we're missing, which this may be more complicated, we don't have a way to report shitty content. Like, no matter where you are in our documentation, if you come to something that's wrong, nothing happens, and there's no way for anything to happen. That's so I'd love to understand sort of so that's another thing, right? I just don't, and I'm not a documentation person. Right? I'm a PhD student turned into a developer, turned into open source technocrat or something like that, which I see the most useless human on the planet. But like, I would love to know if there are tools that are designed to do this and make this easier. I haven't heard anybody come out and say, oh yeah, this tool is the one that actually solves everything, or
I don't think there is a tool that solves everything. When we did the pipeline for the manuals, it was a pipeline for manuals. In other words, it is geared to do structured, published content, and comes out of the fact that we wanted to have structured editorial guides and a process to have an editorial process that would publish guides, a bit like what OpenStack does. So we went to OpenStack and said, oh, they're doing it this way, and we'll do it the same, just because it creates nice guides or nice output. But I don't think it should be the only documentation for OpenDaylight. In other words, having a clear, right now, our user guides and dev guides are kind of, they feel like a student patchwork. In other words, all the projects are throwing documentation, and Colin goes in and edits everything and tries to make sure that they submit a certain level of quality, but in the end, he's kind of the student that you send all your homeworks to, and he actually puts it together.
No, I mean, so there's two problems I'd sort of like to tease apart here. One of them is sort of, how do we generate, well, so, and we talk about both of them. How long do we have? Does this end at 3? Does anybody know? So it's just to end in 5 minutes. Great. So there's two problems. There's two problems here. One problem is the tools that we use and what are the requirements. We've talked a lot about the tools are from the endpoint of the person who wants to consume them, which is we really want to be able to produce good HTML. We want to be able to have a way for them to give feedback, and we want a way for them to understand what the intended audience of this whatever they're looking at was, so that way they have an idea of if they're remotely in the right place. Right? I mean, I think, and I'm not sure if I'm missing anything there, but that would be useful. There's another set of requirements at the other end, which are like how would we produce them, and this is sort of, which is like and those are more complicated. But so what's the pipeline internally? And that bleeds into the sort of second problem, which is who is writing the documentation and who's editing the documentation, who's curating the documentation. And I don't have, I think the first one are nice because those are concrete technical engineering problems. We can just fix them. The second problem is what worries me, and I think what worries Casey and the whole bunch of people that are thinking about this, which is right now the way we write documentation is to participate in a simultaneous release. There's a requirement that projects write documentation and that they interact with somebody to help them edit it. And that somebody to help them edit it is me. And I'm not, while I am usually somewhat articulate and actually mostly understand grammar. I have a lot of other things going on. It's probably not a really good strategy, but sort of the thinking about how we, both ends of that, I think is, we don't have any answers. In a company, right, you would have professional documentation people that you employed that would be doing all of this. We don't. And maybe we should, but the Linux Foundation hasn't, essentially the Linux Foundation technically has budget, but would like to spend that budget on documentation as a last resort, which is, and there's good reasons for that, which is that historically speaking, the second the Linux Foundation pays for something, it destroys any chance that the community will provide it ever in the future. And so so as a consequence, in general, there has been a hesitation for the Linux Foundation to pay for everything just because let's see if the community can produce it. And the community produced Dave Neary, who did amazing things, but we need a full-time Dave Neary, and I think we're about to lose our quarter-time Dave Neary. Some. No. I'm gonna miss Dave Neary. You? So okay, so Dave Neary works for Red Hat. He was working on a lot of community outreach and advocacy in OpenDaylight. He's a huge thing. So all of the user studies that you see, like Cornell University, things like that, that's stuff which Dave did. Dave's been hugely helpful in figuring out documentation, all that kinds of things. You're moving to working with OPNV mostly, aren't you? Or am I misstating that? Mostly working.
We'll talk after. You're putting me on the spot.
Sure. All right. So Dave is awesome. Go find Dave. He's a lot of fun to talk to. No matter what's happening, no matter where he's officially working, Dave is a lot of fun to talk to. Is that? But anyway, so I don't have answers. I've got problems, and I would love help trying to figure out what the tooling we should use is. The good news is that Casey and Art, who are both sitting here, they work for the Linux Foundation, and their task isn't documentation, but it's broadly sort of user engagement, and I don't really understand technically what your task is. Generically help OpenDaylight, I know is it, but.
Well, I think for me, right there. For me, it's probably more at the introductory side. I kind of see myself as almost like you might consider like the pre-sales portion of it from a company perspective.
And so this is Art, by the way, who's talking.
Yes, Art, technical marketing. Yeah, and so we're working on introducing a lot of, like what you mentioned, the introductory type of content pages that might, sit on the ODL website and hopefully build people up towards where they can get to, competent to use the documentation. And hopefully, especially in the more introductory sides of the documentation that exists, I'm hoping can help to bring some assistance with that.
And so I think and your Minifill, right? Is that the short description?
Yeah, my unofficial title is Minifill. So official title is,
and this is Casey.
Technical Program Manager for Linux Foundation. My name is Casey, and my role is to help drive adoption of OpenDaylight, help the community in any way that they need, whether technical assistance or how to get involved or get projects into OpenDaylight. Basically, all of the hats. If somebody needs something, they can come to me, and I am supposed to either be able to provide the answer for them or get them in touch with the right people.
And so hopefully, I think this is probably all I was really expecting from the session, but we have a pretty good idea that what we're currently doing is not as good as it could be. Which I think would put it as charitably as anybody could put it. We have an idea of what the kinds of properties we'd like a solution to have, and we have, essentially probably net total of, half to a quarter of a full-time person who's actually working on trying to fix this. And what we desperately need is both technical people in order to help us develop the documentation tooling and the tool chains on one side, and non-technical people to help us either evaluate new tools that make that easier or really actually take on developing documentation. And that's not necessarily non-technical people. Just, we need people that are willing to do those kinds of those kinds of tasks, and they're not completely non-technical because understanding what OpenDaylight does is really going to be critical to that. And so that's really, we need boots on the ground and humans. And so the lack of progress I think we've had in our documentation tool chains has not been for lack of understanding what's wrong, but has been for lack of having anybody who is willing to grab it, drive it, and actually invest 20 to 40 hours a week in making it happen. And so if you know anybody like that wants to help, and I'm going to stare at you because you had concrete suggestions. I'll teach you to make suggestions. But what's your name, by the way? Garen. Oh, where do you sit?
In Australia.
Ah, so yeah, no, I didn't. Names escape me. Anyway, so anyway, but that's what we need. And so and unfortunately, we really need a lot of time from somebody. So I think probably what it's going to take is a company, probably a platinum company, because those are the people that have, but I don't care whether it's platinum or not. I'm just, statistically speaking, that's who actually has humans that they can justify investing, but who full-time does this, and probably a couple of them. And so tell your managers that this is something we actually need. I don't know, that's sort of my, and we can figure out where to go from there. But that's, and if you're interested in helping and you have significant amounts of time and you want to help out, I'm not saying that if you don't have 40 hours a week, you shouldn't help, but we need boots on the ground pushing on these problems, and I'm happy to help anybody who comes along. But I think we understand what's wrong, and we don't really understand how to fix it. So help. I don't know. That's sort of the weakest plea ever. But do people have other questions? I mean, hopefully this helped at least understand where we were and what's wrong.
So I kind of represent like an external developer who's
Yeah.
using OpenDaylight, trying to interact with like RESTconf.
Yeah.
And so getting started was difficult because of the documentation. And
Yeah.
so I kind of wound up using the API Doc Explorer to
Yeah, yeah.
understand the structure of things. And so maybe a very quick and intermediary step might be just some annotations there, some descriptions of what each of the APIs do, and just, minimal content would have been like just worlds better than what was there.
Yeah, and cool. I mean, and that's something we could definitely do. I mean, like we actually there's like description fields in the Yang models, and just passing the description fields through into the API doc would be cool. Can you file a bug against the API doc Explorer? Right, where is that? Is it in the controller? I think it is in controller.
Yeah, but I think it's passing it. It's just most of our Sorry. I think most of the time the information passes through. It's just that the Yang files are missing.
Oh, it's just we have really crappy Yang files. Fantastic.
Yeah.
I think Dave wants the microphone.
Yeah, so one other thing to add to the list is if you can't write the documentation, but there are things that you want to do with OpenDaylight that we haven't thought of, we're collecting those. So there's a documentation wish list in the wiki, which is useful for something, documentation/wish list. And that's where we're collecting them, but it's kind of the to-do list that I've been building up.
Yeah, and I can pull.
And right now it is my best guess for what people want to do. So if there's stuff on there that you say nobody would want to do that, please let me know too, because I'm not a networking person traditionally. So just telling us what you want to do and can't do is also, as you've just found out, useful, because then we can fix it.
And so if you go to documentation/wish list on the wiki, this is what Dave's talking about. At least that way it'll be in the recording.
So the goal there is kind of user-focused, user-task-driven documentation, which I have a problem or I have a thing I want to do, and how do I do it?
Yeah. Don't know how to do it.
Because this is what I was going to say, is that I'm not necessarily a networking person. A lot of the people who are developers on the project, I'm pointing at Colin, he's probably the worst example, the worst person to point at for this, what I mean. But are focused on their project and not necessarily how it fits into a big picture and how it might be used from a user level. So just letting somebody like me know what you want to do gives us something we can work with.
So if you're interested in helping out, and I know that I think I've heard 3 people from Brocade that are interested in helping out, which is awesome. It's awesome to be at the company where people actually want to help. But if anybody is interested in helping, I'm happy to figure out what the most productive way to engage is. And I know that Gary and Mark, both from Brocade, have said, we want to help out, and they want to help out sort of improving some subs of the documentation. We have a bunch of documentation. People that are willing to edit it and enhance that's always going to be awesome. If there are people that are interested in doing, doing more in the sense of actually helping with the tool chains or evaluating new tools, completely new tools, that's also stuff we could use. But sort of any help we can get would be great. I'm happy to coordinate how the help goes. But anyway, that's sort of, I think we understand a lot of the problems. I don't know, Dave, would you be willing to help try and write down sort of like the meta problems that we understand about documentation? Here is, I started doing some of it here, but I feel like we've sort of done this a bunch of times where we haven't quite, just write down everything we understand that's wrong and what the properties we want of a solution are. That would probably help a lot. Yeah. Or just not even a strategy, just a requirements document, right? And I'm happy to try and do that. I sent some emails to the documentation list, but maybe just and then we can get that up there, sort of here. How do you engage? How do you help out with documentation? But I think that the fastest and most productive thing we could probably do is try and find out ways for users and end user developers to actually be able to close the loop, which is understand where to look, trying to make it clear where to look, and if they don't want to find what they're doing, how to communicate they haven't found it and engage, and that's the loop we haven't closed.
Also, on the easy way to give feedback, did you have anything in mind, Colin? Because if we actually get the HTML templating to just do the proper template at the right level, you can actually integrate discuss directly on each of the page, and people
Yeah, I mean, integrating discuss would be one great way. I mean, just having a button somewhere where you can click, and when clicking it, and it emails or generates a notification to anybody in any way, so that
because right now it's just turned off. I mean, there's a bunch of stuff that's just turned off because of the lack of time and.
Oh, and the question is, do you want that on? I mean, I think actually that's going to be more useful on the wiki. So, are there wiki plugins for MediaWiki that we can put in that let you flag? I mean, like you give feedback and comments at the bottom of it. There probably are, because there's plugins for MediaWiki to do everything. There's probably a plugin for MediaWiki that turns every page into an airplane that flies you to Tahiti. It's sort of been my experience with MediaWiki, and it's filled with security vulnerabilities, and it hasn't been updated since 2010. But But I think that's what I was thinking, is basically just every single piece of documentation we produce anywhere, anyway, should have a button somewhere on it that says, here's feedback. Good, bad, happy, angry. You probably want sort of a drop down that is, what mood I am in. Why I'm leaving feedback because I am disappointed, angry, psychotic, want to kill the Pope. I don't know. And then the outline of the thing is below it. That's sort of but that's what I meant. Just every piece of documentation we should produce have some way to close the loop with the people that are reading it, because that's how it will get better. If you don't create a way to close that loop, it's not going to get better.
I just wanted to throw this out there. I think I've mentioned it to a few people in this room, but want to throw the idea out there for any feedback, or if anybody has any ideas or suggestions. But one of the things that would really help a lot here is more resources, right? And I'm firmly kind of the belief myself that if we were to think about changing things a little bit with how internships are structured, how we engage with academic community, and be a little creative, not what we typically think of as a traditional internship. But say, for example, find a professor who has expertise in this area, who needs to have honoraries, who needs to show activity, and who benefits themselves from that, who's teaching a class of students. And I've been doing on this NSF committee for 7 years now, where what we do is we get business and industry together and make fake real-world case studies for students to do. And we've been doing for 7 years, we've been doing the studies on this to demonstrate the efficacy of it over less than that. And they've all been wonderful. And this has all been going into Washington and working its way through the political system. But it's such a shallow thing compared to if it were actual real thing, and great benefit to us. I think it'd be an honorary professor. And I know there's possibly, would somebody willing to do that? So kind of the way I wanted to ask a question, if I were to find somebody that were willing to do that, a professor who wanted to try to take this on, is that something that you would think?
I mean, I would be stunned if there was anybody that was willing to help out in documentation in any way, shape, or form if we turned them away for anything. Cool. I mean, sure. Yes. Looking. Yeah. So anyway, cool. I think we're 10 minutes past time or something like that. So I'll let people go. If you're interested in helping out, please come help. Yeah, I mean, I think actually, the other high order bit I'll say is I think we've gotten a lot better at documentation over time. As much complaining as we did, the actual documentation we produced for Lithium really isn't. It's still terrible, but it's much better than what we've done in the past. And I think we're iterating and improving, which is what we need to be doing, just to make it not quite the totally depressing, horrible fest that the rest of it was.
So I just wanted to add one really quick comment. It's kind of just to reiterate what Colin has already said, and it's just that documentation for OpenDaylight is critical to the success of our project. So anybody that helps, you will be our hero, and not only our hero, but the entire community, because it is so critical. If we don't improve our documentation, we will fail.